So I will formally introduce Aleyamma Mathew, who is the Director of Women's Economic Justice at the Miz Foundation for Women. Aleyamma most recently served as the Policy Director at the Partnership for Working Families, providing support to network partners in running multi-city campaigns. Aleyamma has over 10 years of experience working nationally and locally on social justice issues. She has conducted trainings on implementing local city policies, using human rights frameworks, and participating in the UNCERD review process in Geneva to highlight human rights violations against women of color in the United States. Aleyamma was also part of the Founding Steering Committee and served as Program Director for the National Coalition of Asian Pacific American Community Development. In that capacity, she helped establish its organizational foundation and develop the framing for its core program areas for a national network of community-based agencies serving low-income Asian Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian, refugee, and immigrant communities. Aleyamma has also supported efforts of Taxi Workers Alliance in Pennsylvania, a multi-ethnic membership-led workers' rights organization that represents over 1,200 drivers and in the greater Philadelphia area. She has served on the board of directors for the Center for Community Change and advisory board for the Restaurant Opportunity Center of New York and Washington, D.C. Aleyamma Mathew has also received numerous fellowships, including a Fulbright, the Koros New American Leaders Fellowship, and the Asian Pacific Leaders Fellowship at the East-West Center in Honolulu. She received her master's from the New School for Social Research in New York City and her BA from Temple University. Please join me in welcoming our speaker this evening, Aleyamma Mathew.
Thank you all so much for being here. Can everybody hear me? Great. You know, I went to a lot of rallies, so I've worked on my outdoor voice. Thank you so much, Gardy, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to from the Women and Gender Studies and the Office of Social Inclusion, and also the Intersectional Feminist Collective. How many of you are from the Intersectional Feminist Collective here? Great, awesome, I love your name. As Gardy said, I'm the Director of Women's Economic Justice at the Miz Foundation for Women. How many of you know what the Miz Foundation for Women are? Great. So, we're a foundation. We are a national grant-making institution. We give out funds to small grassroots organizations around the country to help run their programs and to support different initiatives that secure women's equality. My program is the Economic Justice Program. I lead, I direct the institution's work around this area. In addition to doing grant-making, we're also a national advocacy organization, which means that we go to DC and advocate in Congress and with different federal agencies around issues to advance women's equality and economic security. The Miz Foundation was actually started in 1973 by activists that were very much front and center in the women's movement at the time. Some of them include iconic feminists like Gloria Steinem. Anybody know Gloria Steinem in the room? Okay. So, you know, Gloria Steinem was a journalist, and she used to write for The New Yorker, and she really felt that while she was working for The New Yorker, that there weren't enough women's voices being represented in the public media space. And so she created Ms. Magazine, which was a progressive magazine for that many, I'm sure many of your parents grew up on it and bought it in newsstands. A lot of people said that that magazine wouldn't see the light of day or even exist after 3 months, but it still runs in circulation 41 years later. And so a lot of the proceeds from the Ms. Magazine was the initial seed money to start the Ms. Foundation. And so for 41 years, the Miz Foundation has supported grassroots organizations all around this country. We do grant making in women's safety to ensure that women are not living with violence either in their home, in their workplace, or public institutions like universities. We also do grant making around women's health, ensuring that women have access to comprehensive reproductive care, as well as health care more broadly. And then finally, the economic justice program. And so in the economic justice program, what we focus on is to look at women in the workplace. Over the past 50 years, we've seen very striking demographic changes in terms of labor participation of women in the workplace. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We also talk a lot about the economy and the women's role in the economy, and why it's really important to focus on raising standards for women in the workplace. To the point that Anne said, you know, this is Women's History Month. For me, not just because of my occupation or because I'm a woman of color, but I think about gender and women all of the time in terms of I mean, for me, the word feminism is really about equality. It's not counting the number of like women that are, you know, in public office or in a classroom, although those things are important. It's really about changing the power relationships that we see are so innate in so many of our homes and societies, and even in politics and business. And so this kind of relationship of power and reorganizing it is what makes me really enthusiastic about the work that I do. So what I'm going to do today is I want to start off by sharing a little bit of my own personal story and why this work is so important to me. And then I'm going to move on to looking at, to sort of describe what the 21st century workplace looks like, and why it's, and sort of the role of women of color, immigrant women in the workplace. And I'm going to particularly focus on the care sector. Nobody ever talks about the care sector, but it's so vital to most of the things we do. When I mean the care sector, I mean things like healthcare services, child care, elderly care, disability care, which are all sort of supports that lay outside of the realm of the workplace that are so critical for people to be able to work. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in its sort of racialized history in the United States. And to help me, I have this timeline and history that's going to look at the women's movement in the past, since the turn of the century, along with the history of care in the United States. One disclaimer I have is that this is my first Prezi, so I'm sure there's like experts, experts out there, so you can all give me some feedback after we're done. If I talk too fast, if you have a question, we can write it down and we can answer it at the end. And I wonder if there's any other, okay, so that's where we are. So a little bit of, Gardy talked a little bit about my professional experience, and you know, there was a lot in there, and I'm going to sort of shorten it and say it back to you. You know, I actually, I'm not an academic, but I did go to graduate school. I was a gender studies and anthropology major. This is my dad sitting over here. You know, when I decided to be an anthropology and gender studies major, he's like, what are you going to do with that? Surprise, surprise. And so, you know, but I really felt very passionate about it, and you know, I left academia and worked around affordable housing issues in New York City's Chinatown, and really worked with a lot of very poor, low-income people that lived in the area that were being booted out of the neighborhood because of gentrification. And one of the things that I recognized was that you know, Asian and Pacific Islanders are usually seen as you know, they have money, they made it, they're the model minorities. And it just wasn't true in these sort of neighborhoods. And so, so you know, so I started this national organization called the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. The short term was national capacity to really raise the visibility of Asian and Pacific Islander communities, and also to raise the visibility of new immigrant communities. After that, I worked with an organization called Wild for Human Rights. Wild stood for Women's Institute for Leadership and Development for Human Rights. The organization was formed in 1995 after the Beijing Conference on Women, where a group of women from the United States, from all different racial and ethnic backgrounds, went to Beijing to participate in this international conference and realized that the United States never holds themselves accountable to the human rights standards that it holds other countries accountable for. And so, so this group, Wild for Human Rights, started in order to document some of the abuses that happen here in the United States. During my tenure there, we documented abuses that happened to people inside of women's prisons, including the trans community inside of California women's prisons, destruction to their reproductive capacity, a series of different sort of sexual violence, violations that happened to them while in prison. And of course, you all know that we have the largest prison system in the world, and many of the people who are particularly in women's prisons are trans-identified and or women who are survivors of domestic violence. Categorically, like, you can divide those populations in half, and those are the people that you would see in women's prisons. After I left working at Wild, I moved to DC again, and I worked on national level policy issues related to workplace policy and labor rights, and did a lot of advocacy on the Hill and with federal agencies. On a personal level, what moves me to do this work is partly my own history. I moved to this country as an immigrant when I was very young. You know, most labor migrations from other countries, usually it's the men that move to the country first. And they bring their families, or they came first to this country. And you know, I'm part of maybe a unique, not so unique community that came from India in this small state called Kerala, where women migrated first. When my mother moved here, she was in her early 40s already. She was married, she had 3 children. We moved to Philadelphia, and I grew up in a predominantly working class neighborhood where everyone in the neighborhood, I mean, there was white working class people, there was the historic African American community that was there, and then there were all these new immigrant populations, Korean and Southeast Asian, Caribbean, West African, North African. And so that's sort of the world that I sort of came of age in, is this place where, you know, many of the histories that marked immigrants and communities of color, as well as poor white communities, were sort of intertwined in my own history. And so there was a lot of questions for me about, you know, what does this all add up to? And I remember going into like a Western Union when I was younger, and you know, I would just see all of these like different immigrants sending money back home to send as remittances. Does everybody know what remittances are? Remittances is money that immigrants and migrants send back home to their home countries. So you know how, I mean, I don't know how many of you, you know, get money from your parents, but sort of it's a little bit of a form of remittances. It's money that, you know, a lot of people move to this country for different sort of economic opportunities, and there's a, you know, and many of these families want to send money back home to support their families. My family came from a rural community in India. So when I used to go to the Western Union, I remember the shop owner I would comment about the diversity of everyone in the room, and the shop owner would say, yeah, you know, the world is changing right now. And you know, it was 1980, and indeed the world was really changing, and I couldn't tell growing up in that working class community in Philadelphia that I had something to do with that change. And so, you know, my mother moved here as a nurse. For 20 years, she worked as a nurse in India. And if, you know, when I started to learn about what she did in India as a nurse, and followed her history of being a nurse for 50 years, you can see that her story sort of paralleled her own life. So for example, in her 20s, she worked in a women's clinic in rural India providing comprehensive reproductive care for women. In her 30s, she was an emergency room nurse at a railway hospital in a place in eastern Gujarat, where she met this guy. And then myself and my siblings were born. And then in her 40s, she immigrated to the United States States and worked at a dialysis center and also tended to the elderly in nursing homes. And right before she retired, she cared for men and women that survived combat in 4 different American-led wars at a Veterans Administration hospital. She worked the evening shift, she worked overtime. My mother was the primary breadwinner in our family. My father was the primary caretaker in our family. And so there was a lot of different, I mean, I don't even want to call it role reversal, but I would say sort of an equal participation between both of my parents in managing how we survived economically, but also how caregiving was given. You know, and so the reason why my mother was in this country is because of a confluence of a lot of different historical circumstances. My mother, it's not a unique story. She was part of a vast labor migration of women that came over as nurses from India, who left their home countries and went to places like Western Europe and Canada and Australia. In the United States, sort of the confluence of historical events were first the retirement of post-World War II nurses that created this sort of occupation gap in the United States. Second was actually the increasing need for medical care when young men and women came home from the Vietnam War. So not only was there a shortage of nurses, but then there was an increased need for nurses because of the Vietnam War. Some people argue that the feminist movement that was on the rise at the time in the 60s and 70s encouraged women to explore occupations, untraditional occupations, not the usual feminized ones, where caregiving and nursing fell under. And so there wasn't a lot of people within the United States that were going into those professions. Simultaneously, way over there on the other side of the world, a whole generation of rural Indian women received free vocational training from Canadian and English missionary schools in nursing. And so when this opportunity came up, the US actually gave expedited visas to people in the global south, in developing countries who were nurses, to come here and fill a labor gap. And so that's how I'm standing in front of the room with you today. This money that people sent home as remittances, and part of my argument is that, you know, the importance of investing in women is not just for equality's sake. It's because women are actually running not just the economy here in the United States, but a global economy, and we have not really pulled that to the surface yet. These remittances, you know, that people send back home, some of them, you know, is a love and longing for their childhood homes and wanting to give back to their parents and making sure they're okay. Some of it is sort of an apology for like an undetermined absence. You know, in my immigrant community, there's many of us, including my parents, who were here while their parents passed away and their siblings passed away in another country, and so, you know, sending these remittances back home was one way to kind of, you know, reconcile some of that loss. And then, you know, I think an unintentional consequence of remittances is that it was actually fueling the economy of many emerging countries around the world. In fact, in 2013, the World Bank reported that there are $404 billion in remittances that are sent to developing countries. This is more money than the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank gives to developing countries in international aid or relief. Okay, so. So I say all this not to tell the story of my mother and how we came here, even though I think it's kind of interesting. But it's because, you know, when I was growing up and I would see these women in my church, you know, on Christmas and singing their songs, wearing their saris. You know, there was a moment that I was struck by the fact that these women who are in this room are actually fueling a global economy and actually revitalized a stagnant economy in the state of Kerala a half a world away. And even though nobody talked about it, we all knew that that was happening. And so these are some of the things that made me interested in looking at like women in the workplace and the economy and how gender roles had changed. Over the past 50 years, I know many of you have hopefully have seen the movie Selma. If you haven't, you should go out and see it. But it does celebrate the 50th year anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement, which was very significant in our history. And there's a lot of different anniversaries that follow around now. So one of the things that have happened that really changed the tides of women's rights and equality was actually advances to women's health and family planning. And this really, in the 60s and 70s, this really gave women the ability to make choices around family planning and enabled them to enter the workforce, opened up educational opportunities, and really set them on a path to increase their income potential. And the importance of women being able to work and gain income is that it adds up to being able to make choices in this world and take opportunities. And these are especially important because without these, without having economic security, you could be stuck in all kinds of different situations, like being in a domestic violence situation and not being able to get out is one part of it. But anyway, all this to say is that there was many advances that were made in the 60s and 70s in terms of women being able to enter the workforce. But some of these factors around equality do not apply to all women. Right now in the labor force, some of the biggest, fastest growing jobs are in the low wage sector. Low wage sector means that people earn the minimum wage or below. The minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. $7.25 an hour working full time all year long translates into about $15,000 a year. We have not had a minimum wage increase since 2009. Even though the cost of living has gone up, we haven't seen that sort of parallel in the increase in minimum wage. So this is, low wage jobs are the fastest growing jobs in the US. It's either service sector jobs, care jobs, or manufacturing jobs. And so 60% of the workforce are women. 40% of all women in the United States are the primary income earners in their households. This is a statistic that was released last year by Pew Charitable Trust. That's unprecedented. Never in the history of the United States have women been the primary income earners in their household. So we're looking at a major demographic shift that has happened. And again, just to return to the point earlier, we're not investing in women just because we believe in equality. We're investing in them because they are so vital to our economy right now. So I talked a little bit about the minimum wage. The three issues that we work on at the Miz Foundation in our economic justice program is we support campaigns around the country that increase the minimum wage. The minimum wage was signed into law in 1938 by President Roosevelt and at the height of the Great Depression. And its purpose was really to help the American workers get out of poverty and actually help the economy to increase their consumer purchasing power and ensure that we were stimulating the economy, right? In some sectors, like the restaurant industry, anybody ever work in the restaurant industry? How much did you guys get paid an hour? $2. Huh? $15? $2.15. So the federal minimum wage for restaurant workers is $2.13 an hour. Even though there's been increases in the minimum wage, there has not been an increase in the federal tipped minimum wage. And the reason why is because there's a very powerful lobby called the National Restaurant Association. The head of the National Restaurant Association is a man named Herman Cain. Some of you might remember him because he ran for president. And he was also very well known for sexual harassment of women in the workplace. And so if you actually look at how many women work in the industry, 70% of restaurant workers, restaurant servers, are women. And so when you get paid $2.13 an hour, yeah, maybe if you're working in a fine dining restaurant, you walk home, you can make, $50, $60, $70,000 a year. But even in those fine dining restaurants, if you ever go to a fine dining restaurant, who are the servers in those restaurants? They're predominantly men. Right? So there is an occupational segregation based on the amount of wages that happens in the restaurant industry. Most people work in a place like IHOP or Red Lobster. IHOP and Red Lobster are all owned by a company called Darden. It's the largest global restaurant chain in the world. And so for 23 years, there have been many advocates that have tried to raise the tip minimum wage, but they haven't been able to do it because of the National Restaurant Association, the power that it has. So what's happening is that a lot of women who are in this industry have to work on such, not even the minimum wage, but sub-minimum wages. And when you get paid sub-minimum wages, you are taking home who knows how much. It's so unpredictable what you take home. And then also it makes you vulnerable to like sexual harassment in the workplace. You can't get out of the job in any kind of way because you're really dependent on it for income. There's a lot of different strategies that you can do, but I'll talk about that later. The other sort of trend we're seeing is because of the growth of low wage job sectors is the dependency on public subsidies. Public subsidies are things that taxpayers pay for. There was a time between like Roosevelt and the Johnson era when the word known as welfare was actually like a good thing. It would create the Great Society. Things like Social Security is considered welfare, and who knows if it'll be here, when I get old and in another generation. But the dependency on public subsidies, I think one of the places where you can really see the it used to be that people on welfare were not employed, and so this welfare was supposed to help them sort of get through life while they sought employment. What's really different right now in the workplace is that employed people have to access public subsidies in order to offset the abysmal wages that they get. So for example, if you go to Walmart to get a job, anybody work at Walmart? Don't. If you go to Walmart, they pay such low wages, they don't have health benefits. And so when you're in the orientation session, they actually hand you paperwork to fill out subsidy forms for childcare and for food stamps. That's just like an obvious admission that like your wages will not cover the full breadth of how you're going to be able to survive. It's not a livable wage. And so you're sort of forced into this public subsidy system. The other thing that we're focused, so the Miz Foundation and my program look at how do we increase public subsidies right now because we know so many families need them. The other thing we're looking at is really workplace policies. When 50 years ago, when the majority of the workforce were men, and there were like 300 people in a Ford Motor Company, the things that unions fought for were, I'll call them like bring home the bacon issues. They were things like wages, benefits, and workplace safety. It was to secure that the worker, who was usually a man, like he was the asset in the family, right? And so it's to make sure that he earned his wages, he didn't get his arm lopped off, or he didn't get lung cancer from going into a coal minery. Now that the world has changed and the workplace has changed, we have to think of new workplace policies. It's no longer a time when only you can subsist as a family on one income. Like it really takes two people or more, actually right now, to be able to support a family. And so, the reason why like women are in the workforce, one can argue it's because of equality and, our choice. But the other real reason is we have such poverty level wages that it requires like everybody who can work to be in the workforce in order to support a family, right? And so some things that are really important are things like lack of paid sick days, family medical leave, some of the challenges that people have in the retail industry is unpredictable scheduling, forced overtime, access to affordable childcare. There's a whole set of issues that are no longer just wages and benefits that have to be changed in terms of workplace policies, but they're actually issues that affect the way that you can actually care for your family. If you can't take a sick day to take care of your child, if you feel like you're going to lose your job because you make a decision to take care of your child versus come to work, that's a big deal. If you don't have family medical leave to care for your parents when they get ill, and the one thing about this generation is that there's a term called sandwich generation. They're usually people of my age that have children. They're caretaking for young children while they're caretaking for aging parents. Okay, so care, the who does care becomes a really critical question in being able to achieve economic security. And so this is where the care sector really comes in, and the Miz Foundation has a particular focus on the care sector. People can argue that, if you are working all the time, working 2-3 jobs all the time, who's caring for your children, right? There's an absence of an adult at home. And what happens, and we're seeing all across the country, is that particularly low-income kids, and particularly kids of color, are being criminalized because for a number of different, and over-policed in many different neighborhoods across this country. There's a lack of mentorship and stability, one can argue, but overall it really impacts like the next generation in very significant ways when you don't have somebody there to be supportive. It affects the elderly in this country. I don't know if you know the statistic, but this kind of blew my mind. Every 8 seconds in America, a person turns 65. What's that?
I just saw that online.
Yeah. And so in this conversation, there's been like hundreds of people. I mean, in this talk, there's been hundreds of people that have turned 65 in this country. We're on the verge of an elderly boom. Like a lot of the baby boomers are growing old right now, and so the care needs of the elderly population is really happening right here in this room right now. It's on us. Parents. The impact of these low wages really resonate with parents. There's a statistic that says to raise a child born in 2013 to the age of 18, it will cost a middle-income family over $245,000. According to the Department of Agriculture. That's $250,000 just to have one child and raise them. We're not even talking about college, right? So, anyway, and of course the care sector. The care sector is going to be so critical in the future in our lives. It's going to be the cornerstone of our economy, of the way that we're able to work. And you don't want to just have anyone care for your elderly parents or your young children. You want to have somebody who's fully qualified. Yet the care sector is among some of the lowest paid jobs in the country. People earn anything from $13,000 to $25,000 a year, which is not a livable income. And most people don't stay in that occupation for very long. So, anyway, so that's, I just wanted to put that sort of into context about where we are right now in terms of our economy and why, women's participation is so important. And then I'm going to switch over. I guess I'll stop right here and just take like 1 or 2 questions or comments if people have them. Yes, go ahead.
You were talking about the necessity for women, right, to leave the home, quote unquote, to enter the workforce out of necessity by virtue of the fact that, hey, the reality is 2 incomes are what is needed more and more. And and the first thing that comes to mind is, women of color, and how, that may have, or that how that dynamic may have always been the case for women of color or not. So,
yeah, we did. Wow, that was quick. Yeah, it's fixed. So, so that's a really that's a good question, Gardy. It sort of goes into a little bit of this presentation. You know, there's a lot of, there's a really great book by a woman named Pramila Nadsen, and it's called Welfare Warriors. And it really looks at sort of the right to motherhood and work. And so this idea that, you know, it was very different earlier on. Like earlier on in the U.S. history, white women were, or like middle-class white women were sort of, their primary responsibility was to caretake in their homes, while women of color cared for their children, right? And then what's changing right now after the 1960s is that now there's this, a lot of middle-class families can, or upper-middle-class families can afford childcare, and so it does enable them to go to the workforce and participate in the workforce, while a lot of people who don't have the income, you know, childcare is not cheap. It's like $30,000 a year, right? $30,000 a year, that's somebody's salary. So you either go to work and then use all of your income to pay for childcare, or you get out of the workforce and you rely on public subsidies, and even that doesn't cover the cost of care. So there is a racialization to the way that we can think about like care work. So I'm just going to go right into this and tell you a little bit about it. Since we're in Women's History Month, I thought I'd go through a little bit of history. So in 1920, women get the right to vote, right? And this was the culmination of a lot of work that happened over 2-3 decades prior to this. And I'm just going to go through like quick snapshots. In 1890, there were two different rival, I shouldn't say rival organizations, but two different sort of suffragist movements merged into one and created the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. And so this organization, NAWSA, was really a broad-based organization, included black and white women, immigrant women, and it was all towards the cause of ensuring that women had the right to vote. Very quickly, it became clear that, that there was a better chance of women getting the right to vote if they excluded African American women. And so, so African American women dealt with not only the sexism of being withheld the right to vote, but also the racism by white suffragists. The struggle for vote did not end with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. In some southern states, African American women were unable to freely exercise their right to vote until about the 1960s. But this did not deter many of them from still accessing the right to vote. So I'm doing sort of a parallel history of the women's history on top and the care history on the bottom. So around the Great Depression, or yeah, so it's turn of the century into the 1920s, while women are getting the right to vote, you know, this is what's going on with like childcare. There's sort of like 3 different types of care, which still kind of exists today. Like when you look at the child care system in the United States, it goes back to this very moment. There's the type of care that happens with among upper middle class women who usually hire nannies. You know, part of their lifestyle is leisure. You know, the kind of emphasis is on the optimal growth of the children. And so, you know, they're put through all these activities. Sort of like the Montessori school era is sort of coming into place. The other form of childcare is happening among poor children. These are new immigrants, Jewish, Italian, Germans, Irish immigrants that are coming to this country. Early reformers like Jane Addams set up childcare centers for working mothers. To really support their integration and assimilation into American culture. For others, you know, anybody heard of the Triangle Shirt Fire Factory in New York City? Yeah. So there was a lot of children there, right? And so people like Jane Addams understood that taking your child to work is a dangerous thing, especially if you're working in these unsafe factories. I mean, we're talking about before there was any kind of reform in the workplace to think about like what are safety conditions, you know, and such. And so that's the other sort of form of care was targeted towards low-income kids, children of working moms, single parents, and immigrant children. And then there's the nanny, right? The child care worker themselves. I mean, this is such a sharp contrast in terms of an image, but the nanny. So and this is an occupation that didn't emerge just suddenly, like it's like black women or nannies. This is the job that many African American women had during slavery and after, right? And just one note that I'll probably make again, in the around 1936, 1939, I forget the exact date, there's the National Labor Relations Act is signed. The National Labor Relations Act give a whole bunch of set of protections to workers all across the United States. Northern Democrats and Southern politicians lobby to exclude domestic workers and agricultural workers from the protections in the National Labor Relations Act. And why? Why? Because these are the jobs that were done by African American men and women during slavery and after, right? This law, this exemption still exists today. So agricultural workers and domestic workers do not have the same rights as any other person in the labor world. So then we move to the 1930s. World 1930s, 1940s, you know, World War II is happening. Many men go off to war in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, a bunch of different places. What happens? Women enter the workforce, right? These are some of the ads. Do the job he left behind. There were women from all different backgrounds that participated in the war effort. I like this one. This is actually a group of women that are putting out the fire from the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So when this is happening, it really created a crisis around childcare. The men are off to war, women are in the workplace. Who's watching the kids, right? There was a lot of critics that opposed women working outside of the home, saying that there would be like psychological consequences for children. Some others said that we had to force the federal government to support child care. There was a strong belief that women should not be in the workforce at all. But the need for the workforce was there. And so this is the first time in history that the United States had a publicly funded child care program. But it was not for everyone. Like if you were a teacher, you couldn't get it. But if you worked in the war industry, you could have access to free child care. This is a photo from a facility in Springfield, Massachusetts, in an armory, right? So what happened is that, you know, women would be in the, like making bombs and airplanes and drilling things and doing all of this stuff. And inside of this war factory, missile factory, there would be this child care center where they would get subsidized provisions for care. Then we move into the 60s and 70s. We see the civil rights movement happening. There's a strong voice for equality. The women's movement and access to reproductive care is established in 1973. The LGBT movement has really sort of reorganized the way we think about families and gender and sexuality, and forced us to think about what do untraditional families look like, how do they access care, how are they thinking about rights, right? This idea of intersectionality, you know, everybody throws that word around. Anybody, if you ever take a gender studies class, you see this word. What does it mean? It means all of these things. It means that we are whole people. We are not just, you know, white women or black women. We're not just women. We're not just rich or poor. But like we are a confluence of different identities at the same time. And we look at the people as sort of whole people. During 1969 to 1971, there's a coalition of feminist labor leaders, civil rights leaders, and early childhood advocates that work to legislate universal child care policy. I don't know if you guys all understand the impact of this. Like, universal child care policy means like some family wouldn't have to pay $30,000 a year to access care. Like, the Affordable Care Act is one version of this. It's not perfect yet, but it's one version of this. It's a publicly subsidized program. So we pay taxes so we can get health insurance. Similarly, this happened in the United States. Congress, both Democratic and Republicans passed what was called the Comprehensive Child Care Development Act of 1971. And it set there was like billions of dollars that were set aside, billions, can you imagine it, from our federal budget that was set aside for child care. How come we don't have it today? Because President Nixon vetoed it. Because he believed that it was promoting communism, communal sentiments, like the Soviets, and that it would create instability to the American family life. Yep, so there goes that golden moment of childcare. We move into the 1980s, right? We come out of this really great transformational moment where, like, LGBT, women, you know, we're at this civil rights, we're at this really intersectional moment. Title VI, like, removes all barriers under the Civil Rights Act, removes all barriers for women. And then the Vietnam War is over. I moved to the United States. And then this happens. The Reagan administration comes into power. What was left of any kind of child care funding, there's still some child care funding in the United States, was suddenly shifted. There was this idea called Trickle-Down Theory. It meant that if you increased capital for the richest people in this country, it would trickle down to the poorest people. Can you imagine? So, you know, like sometimes, like, I sit and wonder, I was like, how could this have happened? We went through such a progressive time to, you know, this time. And so a couple of different things happened. There was actually like an intentional culture change that was manufactured in the United States. Not to be conspiracy theorists, but some of it is. This is all sort of things that I picked up from right-wing magazines. The moral majority and the Christian right were painting new images, right? Like, we came out of a time in the 30s and 40s, the Great Welfare Society was in place. You know, the federal government would really be this support system for poor and middle-class families to be able to change their lives. And suddenly, there's this criminalization of the welfare queen. Like, this actually says that people who serve in the US military are welfare queens, and they're just chasing imaginary weapons of mass destruction, right? How different is that? There was the growth of fundamentalism, the Christian fundamentalism. You know, the way that this played itself out is that it criminalized, you know, certain communities. Suddenly, like, HIV and AIDS became like a gay disease, a gay problem, right? Like Rock Hudson, all these things are coming out. Homosexual diseases threaten American families, right? So we're seeing this like vast criminalization. We move into the 1990s, and welfare reform happens. So what welfare reform did, I really love this image. See, welfare used to mean like throw me a line, save me because I'm sinking right now. I just lost my job, I have 2 kids, these things are happening. what welfare reform did was that it forced people to go back to work. So it's not a really good program, like, from my opinion. What it does is that people have to work in order to maintain some type of subsidy, like food stamps or TANF. So so you temporarily rotate through the workforce, right? You have to either be in a workforce development program, which lasts 6 months, and then you get out of it. You usually don't find placement in a job somewhere. If you're going to go back into the workforce, who's caring for your children? Because then you have to pay all of this money in order for this to happen, right? So anyway, this becomes, so what happens is that, the other really great moment and what's really great about welfare warriors is that it really looks at particularly women of color as like a very, people forget about the welfare rights movement in this country, but it was one of like the fiercest movements that had happened that really was like sort of the intersection between civil rights and women's rights. And poor people. It was a poor people's anti-poverty movement. And so a lot of the welfare rights organizations sort of rejiggered themselves to become child care advocacy organizations because they really had to support a lot of women going into the workforce. Many of these organizations are grantees of mine. So I hear a lot about it. Now we're in like 2000, 2010, like our current era. And so, so what happens is governments, the federal government plus played, so there's a whole bunch of new things that happen. One is deregulation. Deregulation of businesses and corporations mean there's less federal oversight over the ways that corporations manage their companies, right? So they don't have to listen to the National Labor Relations Act if they don't want to. There's a whole set of loopholes that are being created at this time. Union density, for a long time, a lot of people, like a lot of your parents, grandparents who were in union jobs, my father, who was in a union job, were able to create some kind of economic stability because unions were fighting for their health benefits, for their wages, and for collective bargaining rights. That started to deteriorate. I mean, it's a complicated issue with unions. The other thing that happened is that there's a lot of fancy words out there: contractor, subcontractor, contingent labor, no central workforce. What does that mean? Is that what we were seeing was that there was no longer, there were new workplace structures. So even if you worked at sort of, there was a union hotel that I worked at that I did some work with, and the union hotel would subcontract to like non-union, like plumbers and electricians, right? So we're not dealing with the same sort of workplace structure that we dealt with in the 1950s and 60s. More people, like the growth of care means that there's more home care workers, or people who are individual homes and workspaces versus like inside of a warehouse with 300 people in them, right? So it becomes very difficult to organize. Taxi drivers are a really good example. They used to be regulated, and in the 1970s, the taxi industry in New York City became deregulated. And so what that meant was that everybody was seen as an independent contractor. And so that means, oh yeah, I'm a small business person, I drive my own cab. But what it really means is that in New York City, if you're a cab driver, you have to lease your cab from a leasing company. And if you lease it for a day, it's $400 to $500 per day to lease a cab, right? So the moment you get into the car, you are starting off with debt. You have to pay, you have to make sure you collect enough money that day to pay off that $400, $500, and then after that, that's when you start earning your wages. So it's a very different kind of work environment than the one we knew before. The new working class, or I should say middle class, they're usually poor. Poor meaning you earn federal minimum wage. They're usually women of color, and they're working. They're not on welfare. They're not on public subsidies and not working. They're on public subsidies and working. This last one, links from local to global. You know, I don't think anyone can deny that, like, you know, all of our products like Gap or whatever we buy are manufactured in another country. Like, we can no longer look at the point of creation of any product being the United States. Like, the point of creation of a product and the point of consumption is not happening in the same place anymore. It stretches across the globe right now. So it's important for us to really get out of our American exceptionalism and make connections to a global community. The excluded worker issue that I was talking about before that showed up with agricultural workers and domestic workers, there's actually an organization called the Excluded Workers, well, they were called the Excluded Workers Congress, and now they're called the United Workers Congress. And they took this language of exclusion and really broadened it to groups other than inclusive of agriculture and domestic workers, but also a broader category of people who are independent contractors and don't have the same rights in the workplace. And they do really amazing work. So this comes to the title of this session. Our gross domestic product is actually women's labor right now. As I said before, some of the fastest growing job sectors in this country are health services, personal care, child care, retail work, restaurant work, right? Highest growth sectors, lowest paying jobs. But if 60% of the workforce are women, then it's women that are holding up our economy right now. This is an image from Rana Plaza, if you guys remember this, in Bangladesh. This is where Gap and, who's the other one? Gap and Walmart? And we always want to blame Walmart. But this is a store that was in Bangladesh that was actually making the materials, and because of the nature of subcontracting, like it was actually Walmart. Walmart had subcontracted so much on the supply chain, right? There's like 54 different subcontractors between like Walmart headquarters and Rana Plaza. So so what happened is that nobody actually was looking at the safety of these buildings and these workers, and one day the entire building collapsed. And so this is an image of a man who had grabbed a woman as the building was collapsing, right? And so we can no longer ignore the global to local link, that this tool of subcontracting your services is actually creating a way for wealthy companies like Walmart to escape accountability around things like this. So the future of this country, as I said, a cornerstone of it is care. So this is a really great image. In the 1970s, you know, the elderly population wasn't as big as it is right now, and it was really us, I mean, the kind of 20, 30-year-olds that were really supporting an older generation. We move into the 1990s and we're seeing, like, I mean, I just feel like this is such a great graphic to show the different ways that we have to deal with caretaking responsibilities, that there's less and less people that are able to provide that care, and the burden of the challenge of caretaking for our elderly is going to become central to our futures. Oops, what happened? Oh no, I turned it off. Okay. So we went through all of this. Low wage industries are the fastest growing, female-headed households. Low wages makes people really susceptible to things like sexual harassment, discrimination, lack of basic benefits. 90% of care workers are women. So equality, like people always say to me, don't women have it all already? Like, isn't the women's movement over? Didn't we do that before? Do we? I don't know. Do we? Women, just like men, only cheaper. But here's the good news. There's I wouldn't say new women's movement, but there certainly is a women's movement that I think is really incredible, and one of the reasons why I love my job so much is because I get to work with all of them. They are a women's movement that are invested in our communities, concerned about our bodies, and then are integral to our economy. This is the domestic workers. They're a really incredible group of people that came out to reverse the exclusion of domestic workers from the National Labor Relations Act. They've been able to pass what's called the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in 9 cities across the country and are working on implementation. They're a group of nannies, house cleaners, domestic workers from all over the world that have come together to do this. I also want to say one thing about this contemporary women's movement is that it's not like the civil rights movements here and the immigrant rights movements here and the women's rights movement is here, is that it's really integrated. Like everyone in this picture has been somebody who has understood what civil rights, women's rights, immigrant rights, poor people's rights are. And so we're seeing a different kind of visibility of integration. It's also a multi-generational, multilingual, and transnational movement that's happening right now around feminism and women's rights. There are men in the movement. Family is based on who we love. One of the things that happens when you rearrange gender norms is that it actually opens up the space to talk about a broader issues around gender and sexuality. This means that we are no longer in this sort of heteronormative space, that lesbian, gay, transgendered families are a part of the way that we conceptualize and think about gender equality. We understand that we can make a change individually, but really it happens all together. So that's it. That concludes my presentation. So